So let me ask you a question. If free trade is such a good thing, then why don't all countries get on board? That's because there are some reasons for protection. And that's what we're going to have a look at in this video. So protection involves government policies that give domestic producers an unfair advantage over foreign competition. In economics, we can think of a number of reasons why countries might want to pursue protection, and the kind of key ones focus on these areas. Infant industry argument, prevention of dumping argument, protecting domestic employment, and this idea of defense and self-sufficiency. So we're going to take these one by one. Okay, our first reason for protection is the infant industry argument. So the idea is this, that early stage industries in an economy, new industries, they're like infants. Infant industries, as the infant title suggests, they're not very developed. They need help. They need to be protected in order to grow up safe and strong. What we're saying is these industries, they need some time and some assistance to gain market share, to train workers, to produce most efficiently, to be able to compete with the adults in richer countries. We'll just be a bit more appropriate in our word choice here. So they need to compete with adults, and adults being industry in more developed nations. So the argument goes, these industries need temporary protection until they can compete with those foreign producers. But the problem here is the word temporary. If someone relies on assistance and they've relied on it for a long period of time, if you suddenly say we're going to take it away, ooh, they're going to get very defensive and be very upset about that idea. So it's very hard to remove protection. So what we can say is this. That protection is rarely temporary, and do they ever become adults, or do they just remain infants forever? Our second argument for protection is about the prevention of dumping. So dumping is about exporting. When we've got X, we just mean exports. Exporting surplus goods to a foreign country at below selling prices in that foreign country. So the effect is devastating for local producers. It's very harmful. In fact, a lot of them could go out of business and would struggle against these low-cost imports. So let's talk this through with an example. Let's imagine that producers in the EU, the European Union, have a large surplus of butter and milk. So they've produced heaps of butter and milk, and they've got too much. So these producers, these EU producers, dump butter and milk in another country. Let's say they dump them in Australia, and they dump them at a price much less than what local Australian producers can charge, because there's this huge surplus. So they're just like, let's get rid of it. Let's charge low prices. Then other producers, so let's say rather than other, say Australian producers lose money because they're not selling as much, and they could be forced out of business, which would increase domestic unemployment. And that what would happen is this. Once the Australian producers shut down because they can't compete, the EU producers will just increase prices because they have no competition. And this is really bad news for consumers and living standards. So for this reason, this particular issue here, it's the only argument economists can see merit in. Dumping is the only economically valid argument against free trade or for protection. Okay, our next argument is the protection of domestic employment. And remember, this is an argument for protection. So this is a really popular argument by governments and unions as well, unions being employer representatives, and it's often used in times of recession. It's actually got not a lot of support among economists because the worry among economists is that those labour resources are going to industries that can't handle it without the support of protection. So the idea here with this argument is that if protection is removed, domestic firms cannot compete with foreign producers. And that what will happen is domestic producers will go out of business and we will see an increase in unemployment. So the argument here is that actually what we should do is that rather than supporting free trade, we should put protection in to support local workers. But there's a couple of economic issues with this argument. Number one here is what I was saying before, is that there's little support among economists because essentially what we're doing is we're keeping workers employed in inefficient industries, industries that cannot survive without protection. The other economic argument against this is that in the long run, more unemployment and lower growth rates because the economy is not going to get more efficient. It's not going to get better at production because we are supporting all these industries just to prevent people losing their jobs. So remember, these are economic arguments. There are other social arguments against those too. The other thing is that other countries might retaliate. Other countries might put in place their own levels of protection to protect their own domestic employment, which could slow down sales of exports from the first country. So it can create all these other issues. Okay, let's move on to the final argument for protection. Okay, our final argument is known as the self-sufficiency or defense argument, national defense argument. And it's really important to know that this is not an economic reason. Basically what it is that countries in sort of situations, particularly of war, countries may want to retain key industries. We can get rid of this second two here. So retain as in they want to keep those industries locally. And the idea is that the countries want to be self-sufficient. They want to be able to do everything themselves because you can imagine in a time of war, can't really trust other people to get you the goods you need. And the idea here is that these countries, they're happy to accept that they might be giving up living standards as an opportunity cost to be entirely self-sufficient. They're okay with doing that because it's a time of war or it's an industry that's so important to them that they won't give it up and let another country do it for them. So, as I said before, this could happen in a time of war where you can't trust another country, or maybe the good itself is so important to the national identity. For example, Japan heavily protects domestic rice, puts lots of trade barriers on imported rice because rice is so important to its national identity. Okay, so these are the reasons for protection. It's very important you're clear on them, that you can talk in detail about them, and also that you can point out some of the economic flaws in these arguments. Okay, thanks very much for watching.